Our story unfolds on the remote shores of Norfolk Island, dated March 31st, 2002. The victim, 29-year-old Janelle Patton, hailed from Sydney, Australia, where she spent her formative years. Her folks always remembered her as a beam of sunshine. By all accounts, she enjoyed a standard, comfortable childhood, excelling academically and surrounded by a solid circle of friends. She shared a tight bond with her relatives, cherishing them deeply. As she transitioned into adulthood, Janelle sought a romantic connection, dating various men, though unfortunately, none of those flings evolved into lasting partnerships. Relatives would eventually reveal that these failed romances weighed heavily on her spirit. Disturbing details emerged that in her mid-20s, a former lover had betrayed her trust with infidelity and physically assaulted her, shattering her jaw. Consequently, she grew, disillusioned with her circumstances. Nearing her 30th birthday, she craved a complete reset. After consulting her inner circle, she announced her intention to leave the mainland. For a while, she had been fixated on a specific destination, a secluded speck of land nestled between Australia and New Zealand known as Norfolk Island. This external territory, once deserted by Polynesian voyagers centuries ago, was charted by Captain Cook in the 1700s. The locale boasts a complex and intriguing past, which I won't exhaustively detail here, though it is well worth your own research. Far removed from the chaotic grind of the metropolis, Janelle believed this sanctuary provided a tranquil existence, prompting her decision to relocate. At that juncture, the permanent community consisted of roughly 1,800 souls, augmented by a rotating cast of tourists. It was considered an exceptionally secure environment. The last recorded homicide had occurred way back in 1893. Residents and vacationers alike often characterized the territory as being near to heaven on earth. Filled with optimism, Janelle secured a position in the hospitality sector and made the move at age 27. She absolutely adored her fresh start in this quiet refuge, where she rapidly built a social circle and entered a partnership. Unfortunately, that romance eventually crumbled. In the aftermath, she became involved in various casual flings, which sparked a series of heated confrontations with community members. One incident escalated physically when a local woman accosted Janelle and struck her across the face. Despite the drama, she maintained constant communication with her folks back in Sydney, missing her parents terribly. Finally, in 2002, 2 years into her island tenure, her family scraped together the funds to fly out. This reunion was intended to be a celebration, yet it rapidly descended into a horror story. Janelle was over the moon when she learned her mother and father were coming. She couldn't stop telling her co-workers and pals about her anticipation. Her parents touched down on March 30th, 2002. She welcomed them at the terminal, played tour guide, and introduced them to her social circle. While her folks booked a hotel room, Janelle remained at her flat. The next morning, she headed to work as usual. The itinerary was simple. Complete her shift at the hotel, then join her parents for a meal around 1 in the afternoon. She clocked in, finished her duties, ran some errands, and took a stroll. The security camera images you are seeing capture the final moments before Janelle met her gruesome fate. As the afternoon approached, her parents prepared for their lunch date. She was scheduled to collect them from their accommodation, but when the clock struck 1 in the afternoon, she was missing. Assuming she was simply delayed, they waited patiently, but she failed to appear. Naturally, her folks grew concerned. They drove over to her residence and pounded on the front door, only to be met with silence. By chance, they encountered a coworker near the building whom they had met the previous evening and inquired about Janelle's whereabouts. The colleague confirmed they had worked together earlier but hadn't seen her since their shift ended. Shortly after, the parents spotted the landlord. They asked when she had last seen their daughter, and she recalled spotting Janelle around 11:30 in the morning. She had been taking her customary stroll, but that was the last sighting. Hours dragged on without a single word. As twilight fell, the real panic set in. Her parents rushed to the local precinct, intending to file a missing persons report. Tragically, that paperwork was unnecessary. Unknown to the family, authorities had already discovered a female cadaver. Officers required their presence not to open a file, but to perform a formal identification. Earlier, walkers on the island had stumbled upon a nightmare scenario at the Cockpit Waterfall Reserve. The remains were in a gruesome condition, showing signs of a violent assault before being discarded at the site. Upon arrival at the station, the couple was briefed on the discovery. Officers suspected it was Janelle and requested a visual ID. The prospect of viewing their child's lifeless body was understandably unbearable, so the landlord intervened. Living nearby and seeing her tenant daily, she offered to handle the grim task. She entered the examination room, viewed the victim, and confirmed the worst to the officers. The parents were then delivered the shattering news. Their daughter was gone, and they were now in the middle of a homicide inquiry. True crime followers know the statistics. Most victims are killed by someone in their inner circle, like a spouse or relative. Now, a glaring detail raised immediate suspicion. Janelle was murdered mere hours after her parents' arrival on the island. The investigators immediately probed the possibility of familial involvement. However, the couple was swiftly exonerated. They had no hand in the crime, and they accepted that authorities had to follow protocol to eliminate them as suspects. As mentioned, this was the territory's first homicide in Onack. Over a century, local law enforcement was ill-equipped for a major capital case, dealing mostly with petty offenses. They urgently needed backup. Consequently, detectives from Sydney and the capital, Canberra, were deployed to support the island force. Word of the tragedy circulated instantly. The story of a young woman slaughtered in an isolated paradise gripped the entire nation. Local residents were reeling in shock. In a community where anonymity didn't exist and doors were left unlocked, trust evaporated. Fears mounted that a predator was hunting solitary women. Panic set in as investigators scrambled to identify the perpetrator. They issued a public appeal for evidence, urging anyone with knowledge to step forward. Immediately, they specifically needed witnesses who had been near the dump site. Then, a truly chilling detail emerged. A group of teenagers approached authorities, admitting they had been at the scene. They had been goofing off, using surfboards to skid down the slick, grassy slopes, while one of them captured the antics on a camcorder. They turned the device over to the police, and when detectives reviewed the tape, they stumbled upon a macabre sight. Janelle's body, wrapped in black plastic, was visible in the frame behind the sliding kids. The group had been oblivious, laughing and playing mirror, yards from a corpse. One can only imagine the trauma that realization caused. Another lead came from a local named Arthur Keeping, who reported hearing a female scream while he was at the golf course around 11:20 in the morning. Suddenly, a piercing shriek cut through the silence. Arthur would later describe it as a distant, continuous wail, lasting about 30 seconds. Tragically, he didn't go looking for the source, nor did he call for help. A few hours later, Janelle's remains were discovered in the exact vicinity of those screams. Other witnesses in the area at the time of the slaying eventually spoke up. They remembered spotting a white 4-door sedan, a detail that would prove crucial to the police investigation. The medical examiner performed an autopsy to reconstruct her final moments, uncovering a scene of absolute horror. Her body lay on the far side of the island from where her landlord last saw her, encased in black plastic sheeting. The evidence screamed one fact: Janelle had put up a massive fight. The assault was prolonged and savage. Her killer used a knife, and in a desperate bid to survive, she had actually grabbed the blade. This severed the webbing between her thumb and forefinger, nearly slicing the digit right off. Her scalp was torn open, while both her pelvis and ankle had been shattered. Shards of glass and paint chips were embedded in her hair, suggesting she'd been bludgeoned with a bottle. In total, the coroner counted 67 stab wounds and deep gashes across her frame. She was black and blue from head to toe, likely beaten repeatedly with a metal pipe. Marks on Janelle's wrists also indicated she had been bound. Deep lacerations marred her face, and a blade had been driven through her eye with enough force to crack her skull. Yet, remarkably, that wasn't the fatal blow. The cause of death was a chest wound that punctured her lung. Her final minutes were pure agony, but she battled her assailant to her last breath. Given the savagery of the crime, police were under immense pressure to close the case fast. Geography was on their side. The island is isolated with strictly controlled data borders. Within 24 hours, authorities had a manifest of every resident and tourist present, scanning their histories for anyone fitting a killer's profile. That meant 2,271 individuals, a few hundred of whom were tourists. Detectives initially theorized the perpetrator was likely a visitor, but they hit a snag. On the day of the murder, a heavy downpour had soaked the scene. Rain fell on the plastic-wrapped body, washing away crucial DNA evidence. However, the storm didn't take everything. Forensics managed to lift several latent prints from the tarp used to conceal Janelle. Now they had a lead. Leveraging the community's small size, officers asked locals to voluntarily submit fingerprints to rule themselves out. Horrified by the violence, the community was eager for justice. Most residents readily cooperated, providing DNA and print samples to the investigators. However, a handful refused, suspecting authorities were using the tragedy as a pretext for a fishing expedition. Police hoped for a quick match, especially as paranoia set in and neighbors began suspecting one another. As the investigation deepened, the list was narrowed down to 16 persons of interest, 16 potential candidates for the savage killing. Surprisingly, every single one was a local, contradicting the early theory that an outsider was to blame. The state posted a $300,000 reward for tips leading to an arrest. Yet, the trail went cold. All 16 suspects were eventually cleared. Detectives had banked on the island's small size, yielding a quick arrest. Someone must have seen something, someone must have talked. It was incomprehensible that a murderer could hide in such a tight-knit town. By 2004, 2 years post-murder with no matches, an inquest began. Public hearings aired uncomfortable truths about Janelle's private life. Portions of her diary were read aloud, revealing a history of abuse and manipulation by various men before she fled to the island for a fresh start. Testimony showed she struggled with deep insecurity, self-medicating with alcohol and antidepressants. It was also revealed that weeks prior to her death, Janelle reported a stalker lurking outside her house. On one occasion, it appeared an intruder had broken in and rifled through her lingerie. The hearings also scrutinized her rocky relationships with local men. But soon after the inquest concluded, the case broke wide open. Detectives zeroed in on a man named Glenn McNeil. A chef from New Zealand, Glenn had been on the island for 2 years when Janelle died. His fingerprints were in the system due to a prior burglary charge. 6 weeks after the killing, he abruptly returned to New Zealand, abandoning his girlfriend. Investigators ran his prints and got a hit. But this wasn't a smoking gun. The defense could argue he touched the plastic sheet anywhere before the killer acquired it. It was a common item, after all. Plus, there were unidentified prints on the tarp that didn't belong to Glenn. But remember those witnesses who spotted a white sedan near the crime scene? It turned out Glenn drove that exact make and model. Detectives were convinced he was their guy, but they needed concrete proof. The hunt began for his old vehicle, a white Honda Civic. They canvassed the locals, and before long, they located the car. Glenn had dumped the Civic on a private lot before fleeing the country, where it sat rotting until 2005. Forensic teams tore the car apart, discovering microscopic glass shards and paint chips perfectly matching the debris from Janelle's head wounds. Even more damning, they found hair in the trunk that matched Janelle's DNA. As for the mystery prints on the sheet, they belonged to a builder named Steve Cochran. It turned out Glenn used to live right next to a site known as Little Cutter's Corn. Cochran was working construction there. The theory was simple. Glenn swiped the tarp from the job site next door and used it to dispose of the body. With the evidence mounting, authorities secured a warrant for his arrest and extradition from New Zealand on charges of murder. On February 1st, 2006, the paperwork went through, and Glenn was apprehended. In the interrogation room, Detective Sergeant Robert Peters laid it out. The jig was up. The forensic link was undeniable. He urged Glenn to confess, and finally, Glenn began to speak. The story started with a panic-fueled accident. He claimed his car struck Janelle, and in a state of shock, he loaded her body into the trunk and drove back to his flat. Once he arrived, he grabbed a knife and went back to the vehicle. That is where the narrative turns grisly. To ensure she was actually dead, he began stabbing and hacking at her. He insisted this frenzy only started because he heard muffled noises coming from inside the trunk sounds that proved she was still alive. Realizing he had crossed a line, he went out back, grabbed some plastic sheeting from a construction zone, and wrapped her up. Next, he drove to Cockpit Reserve to dump the remains. He alleged that he scrubbed the trunk clean and tossed the weapon into the sea. Following this interrogation, he provided a handwritten confession expressing deep regret. The note read, "It was just an accident. I was driving, dropped my cigarettes, and when I bent down to retrieve them, I hit her. I thought it was a dog or a cow at first. When I checked and saw her under the car, I panicked. She was motionless and silent, so I assumed she was gone. I have been haunted by my actions ever since. It has destroyed me, my family, and everyone involved. The depression from that morning has been overwhelming. I have attempted suicide multiple times, just to balance the scales. I apologized to her parents. I couldn't bear the thought of something like this happening to my own partner or children. The mere thought of what I did makes me physically ill, and I just want to do the right thing. I can't live with these daily thoughts anymore. It is eating me alive. This worry has followed me since I left Norfolk. Everything went downhill from that day, until the birth of my first child, yet the burden of the truth about Norfolk remained. It will scar me forever, just as it has scarred her parents. I wish I had just kept my eyes on the road. I have to live with this forever, and so will my kids, who will grow up without really knowing me. I will always be sorry, and I will always hurt." Finally, investigators had a confession that matched the evidence, containing specific details only the killer would know. However, there was a glaring issue. The physics didn't work. His version of events completely contradicted the injuries found on Janelle's body. Furthermore, the autopsy revealed absolutely no signs of a vehicular collision. It became immediately apparent that Glenn was fabricating details. He was admitting to killing her, sure, but he was attempting to sanitize the brutality of the act. The evidence showed Janelle had been in a violent life-or-death struggle. This was never an accident. It was obvious Glenn was spinning a narrative to protect himself, hoping for a manslaughter charge or a lighter sentence now that the net had closed around him. Detectives confronted Glenn, telling him flat out that they knew he was lying. Despite the mountain of forensic evidence proving his story impossible, he dug his heels in, insisting it was all just a tragic accident. Glenn was formally arrested and charged with Janelle's murder. The trial wouldn't commence until 5 years later, but right before proceedings began, Glenn pivoted again. He retracted his entire confession, now claiming that he was suffering from severe mental illness and substance abuse issues involving drugs and alcohol at the time. He argued that his memory of the police interview was non-existent and that his mental state would have led him to admit to anything. Regarding the recorded confession, he asserted that he was merely feeding detectives the story they wanted to hear, dismissing the tape as complete garbage and claiming shock at his own words. He now fundamentally denied that he ever abducted or killed Janelle, claiming total ignorance regarding his fingerprints on the black plastic sheet. The jury of 11 wasn't swayed. They found Glenn guilty of murder, handing down a sentence of 24 years with a minimum non-parole period of 18. But the saga didn't end there. Years into his incarceration, Glenn offered yet another version of events. In this iteration, he claimed total innocence regarding the murder itself, admitting only to disposing of the body. He pointed the finger at a criminal couple involved in the drug trade, alleging they forced him to get rid of the remains. Glenn stated that this couple accused him of theft and threatened to slaughter both him and his family if he didn't follow their orders. According to Glenn, they showed him Janelle's body in the back of a utility vehicle and demanded he make her disappear. No questions asked. Terrified, he complied, but he deliberately chose a conspicuous location to ensure she would be discovered quickly. He also added a new detail. He wore surgical gloves while handling the plastic and later buried those gloves near his residence on the island. Police actually excavated the area Glenn pinpointed, but no gloves or any new evidence were ever recovered. Glenn did name the couple, and phone records confirmed he had been in contact with them in the weeks surrounding the murder. However, the couple's names remain suppressed from the public, and it is unclear if they were ever formally interrogated by authorities. Police dismiss this new narrative as a desperate fabrication, a final attempt by Glenn to wash his hands of guilt. Since then, the case has gone cold regarding new leads. Glenn has now spun 4 or 5 different tales, only some of which I've covered here. While he may invent another scenario in the future, the drug couple theory is his latest defense. Yet, the forensic details remain hauntingly strange. It appeared Janelle had been bound, and the facial wound suggested she was conscious while being held immobile, as if someone was pinning her down specifically to torture her with the knife. Some analysts argue this points to multiple attackers. However, it is entirely plausible that a single assailant could straddle the victim, pinning her arms with their knees, leaving their hands free to restrain her head and inflict the wounds. The official case detectives maintained the lone wolf theory, basing their conclusion on the specific pattern of injuries. Conversely, independent experts who reviewed the files disagree, suggesting the presence of at least one other person. There is also the unexplained matter of Janelle's broken pelvis, the cause of which remains a mystery to investigators. Perhaps most baffling is the DNA evidence. None of Glenn's DNA was recovered from Janelle's body, but the DNA of an unidentified female was found. To this date, that woman has never been named. It wasn't a friend, a relative, or anyone listed in her personal diary. As it stands, Glenn has been paroled and resides in Christchurch, New Zealand. He is subject to strict monitoring, including an electronic ankle tag. He had no violent criminal record prior to this, and prison reports describe him as a model inmate during his sentence. Public opinion remains fractured. Some buy into Glenn's claims of a wider conspiracy, believing police should reopen the investigation. Others are convinced Glenn is a manipulative, cold-blooded killer responsible for the most vicious crime in the island's history. For many observers, the case reads like a dark murder mystery novel, full of contradictions, reversals, and loose ends. At the time of this recording, Glenn remains the only person ever charged with the murder of Janelle Patton.